The bowl shattered into 3 pieces against the floorboards, and neither of them moved to pick it up. Water spread slowly across the wooden cracks, and Abigail Crow stared at her own hands as if they weren't hers, still trembling from what they had just told her in the town square. Behind her, in the doorway, Samuel Whitlock held his hat against his chest and said nothing for a long while. He just watched the water spread. He just watched her. "Leave it," he finally said, and knelt beside the broken pieces. She didn't answer. Her jaw was tight, her eyes forcibly dry, like someone who had learned that crying in front of others was another way of giving them something they didn't deserve to have. Many weeks would pass before the entire town knew what would happen between these two. But that afternoon, with water seeping between the boards and a man kneeling to pick up broken pottery without being asked, something had already begun to stir. Something neither of them yet knew how to name. The Millhaven Creek Valley didn't appear on any map worth consulting. It was barely a handful of wooden buildings clustered around a mill, surrounded by farmland and meadows that turned the color of burnt wheat in the fall. To the west, mountains cut the horizon like a promise no one quite kept. To the east, the road disappeared among poplars until, 3 days later, on horseback, it reached something that resembled a city. Here, instead, time was measured in harvests, in survived winters, and who had arrived first and who arrived later. Abigail had been born in this valley, but no one ever seemed to care. Her mother had come from distant lands to the south, with skin the color of wet earth and a language no one here wanted to learn. Her father, a settler who loved her enough to marry her and enough to defend her until a fever took him when Abigail was 9. Since then, the town had decided, without needing to gather to vote on it, that she didn't quite belong anywhere. Not quite enough of here, not quite enough of there. A daughter of 2 worlds that neither wanted to fully claim. At 25, Abigail ran the town's dressmaking shop with a skill no one could deny, though many preferred to send for fabric elsewhere rather than sit in her workshop for too long. She had quick hands, a straight back, and a way of meeting eyes that made those who preferred her to look away first uncomfortable. She didn't look away. She never had. Not even when it hurt not to. She lived alone in the house that had been her parents' on the edge of town, where the road turned to dirt and the last trees began to look like a forest. She cooked for one, bolted her door every night, though no one ever came to bother her, and had grown accustomed over the years to the idea that solitude was not a tragedy, but simply the climate she had happened to live in. She repeated it to herself often enough to almost believe it. Samuel Whitlock had arrived in Millhaven Creek 10 years ago, still a teenager, with a father seeking cheap land and a future that no longer existed in the East. The father had died soon after, leaving his son a small farm and even smaller debts. And Samuel had built, brick by brick and season by season, something he could now call his own, without shame. He was the kind of man people spoke well of without knowing exactly why. He worked without complaint, paid what he owed, and had a way of listening to people that made them feel, for those minutes, like the only people in the world. At 32, he was still unmarried, and in a town where that was considered almost a suspicious rarity, the explanations circulated were varied, and none of them true. That he had loved someone in the East and lost her. That he was too demanding. That he preferred his land to any company. The truth, which Samuel had never shared with anyone, was simpler and harder to say aloud. He had never found anyone who looked at him the way Abigail Crow looked at him, asking for nothing, pretending nothing, as if she could see exactly who he was and still stay. They had known each other for 6 years, ever since Samuel had brought his only good shirt to Abigail's shop to have a tear in the sleeve mended. She had sewn it in silence. He had watched her work, also in silence. And when she finished, Samuel paid double what she asked. Abigail returned half without a word, with a look that made it clear she didn't accept charity disguised as generosity. Samuel smiled for the first time since he had entered, and something in that smile hung suspended between them, like a question neither dared to ask yet. From then on, visits became regular. A shirt to repair, a button to sew, one excuse after another that they both knew were excuses and both preferred not to name as such. Samuel brought clothes that barely needed fixing. Abigail took longer than necessary to finish them. Neither spoke of this. They talked about the weather, about the harvest, about the town's rumors that neither of them seemed to care too much about, though she cared more than she let on. What neither had said aloud in 6 years was this: that Samuel thought of her while plowing his fields, in those minutes of repetitive work where the mind wanders alone. That Abigail kept in a drawer no one else opened a piece of blue fabric left over from one of Samuel's shirts, for no reason she could explain, even to herself. That each, separately, wondered if the other felt the same, and each, separately, convinced themselves it was better not to know. Knowing meant risking something, and both, for different reasons, had learned that risk came at a cost. The afternoons for returning sewing had become, without anyone planning it, a kind of silent ritual. Samuel always arrived at the same time, when the afternoon light slanted through the workshop window and tinged the dust floating in the air with gold. Abigail always had coffee ready, though he had never asked for it. It was a small gesture, repeated so many times that it had become part of both their landscapes. And yet, each time Samuel took the cup in his hands, he felt something akin to gratitude and something akin to fear, mixed in a way he couldn't explain. One late summer afternoon, Samuel arrived with a stiff right shoulder, after spending the day repairing a section of fence that the wind had knocked down. He said nothing about it. Abigail noticed it anyway, in the way he sat, and how he avoided moving his arm more than necessary. Without asking, she heated a cloth with water and herbs and placed it on his shoulder with firm hands, while he remained still, surprised by the contact, feeling the warmth of the cloth and the warmth of her hands as almost one thing. "You didn't have to do this," Samuel said, his voice lower than he intended. "I know," Abigail replied without removing the cloth from his shoulder. "I did it anyway." They didn't speak for several minutes. Outside, the wind moved the leaves of a nearby poplar, and the sound filled the silence between them in a way that wasn't uncomfortable. It was, Samuel thought later, one of the closest moments to happiness he had felt in years. And the strange thing was that nothing had happened, just a warm cloth and firm hands and the sound of the wind. Another afternoon, weeks later, Abigail casually mentioned that her shed roof had a leak that worsened every time it rained. She said it in passing while measuring fabric, not expecting anyone to do anything about it, because she was accustomed to solving her household problems alone. 3 days later, upon returning from an errand, she found the roof repaired, with new boards that clearly weren't bought by her, and no trace of who had done it, except for the smell of fresh wood and a feeling in her chest she couldn't name for several days. She didn't ask Samuel if it had been him. He didn't mention it. But the next time they saw each other, she served him coffee in the cup he always used, without him having to ask for it. And that, between them, was enough as thanks and enough as confirmation. But what neither of them knew yet was that the entire town was watching them, and that the same voices that had whispered about Abigail's origins for years were now starting to whisper about these regular visits, about these afternoons of shared coffee, about a single man who spent too much time in the workshop of a woman the town had never fully accepted. And those whispers, like all water that seeps through cracks, would soon find a way to reach ears that would use them to inflict pain. The opportunity arrived disguised as a celebration. The town organized a harvest fair every year with long tables set up in the square, impromptu music, and the kind of collective joy that, for one night, made hierarchies seem to dissolve a little. It was also the perfect occasion for Eleanor Briggs, daughter of the most prosperous merchant in the valley, to remind everyone in town where Samuel Whitlock belonged. According to her, according to her family, according to a tacit agreement that had been building for months without Samuel ever having given his real consent. Eleanor was beautiful in a calculated way, with dresses that came from the east and a smile that knew exactly when to deploy. Her father had decided, without consulting his daughter or Samuel too much, that a union between the two families would benefit everyone involved, and had begun to treat Samuel with the familiarity of someone who already considered him part of the family. Samuel, out of courtesy rather than interest, had said neither yes nor no. And that silence, in a small town, was easily interpreted as acceptance. That night of the fair, Eleanor approached Samuel in front of everyone, took his arm with a naturalness that left no room for public rejection, and led him to the center of the square, where people were dancing. Samuel, caught between courtesy and discomfort, found no way to refuse without causing a scene. From the edge of the square, Abigail watched the scene with a calm that cost her every ounce of willpower she possessed. It wasn't jealousy, she told herself. She had no right to feel jealous of something that had never belonged to her. But then Eleanor, at a moment when she thought no one else was listening, leaned towards her friend and said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "Of course he's kind to her. Samuel is like that with everyone, even with those who shouldn't be here." The words reached Abigail with the precision of a well-aimed arrow, and although Eleanor probably knew they would be overheard, she feigned surprise when she noticed that Abigail was close enough to have heard them. Abigail didn't reply. She didn't give Eleanor the satisfaction of a reaction. She simply turned and walked to the edge of town, towards her house, her back straight and her eyes dry until she was far enough away that no one could see her cry. It was that night, in the solitude of her kitchen, that she finally allowed herself to wonder if the town was right. If she had been wrong all these years to think she deserved something more than the conditional tolerance they offered her. Psychologists have documented for decades what happens when a person internalizes repeated social rejection over the years. Researcher Brené Brown, in her studies on shame, has shown that constant rejection not only hurts in the moment, but silently reshapes how a person believes they deserve love, until it convinces them that protecting themselves means expecting nothing from anyone. Samuel found Eleanor alone a while later and told her, with a clarity that surprised them both, that he had never accepted any agreement, that he respected her family but had no intention of marrying her, and that he was sorry if expectations had grown without his consent. Eleanor didn't take it well. Her pride, wounded in front of a town that was already starting to talk, soon sought a place to vent. And that place was, inevitably, Abigail Crow. In the following days, Eleanor and her father began to pressure the town in more concrete ways. Eleanor's father owned the valley's only supply store, and he began to suggest, subtly at first, and then without it, that perhaps it would be better for everyone if Abigail sought clientele elsewhere. The fabrics Abigail needed for her work began to take longer to arrive. Then they stopped arriving altogether. Some families, who had been regular customers of her workshop for years, began to find excuses to take their sewing to another town, 3 days' journey further. Abigail quickly understood what was happening, and understood, with a knot of fear in her stomach, that her entire livelihood could disappear in a matter of months if this continued. She had no land of her own to sustain her, like Samuel. She had no resourceful family to turn to. She had her hands, her craft, and a town that seemed increasingly willing to take them away just to punish her for existing the way she existed. It was Samuel who first noticed something changing when he arrived one afternoon and found the workshop devoid of its usual orders, the work tables cleared in a way he had never seen in years. He asked what was happening, and Abigail, after a long silence, told him everything, her voice struggling to remain firm and only breaking at the end when she said, "Maybe it was always like this. Maybe I was just slow to accept it." Samuel felt something ignite in his chest that he didn't recognize as anger until later, but that afternoon he said nothing yet about what he intended to do. He just stayed longer than usual, helped tidy what remained in the workshop without her asking, and before leaving, he said something she would keep for weeks. "This town doesn't decide your worth, and I am not going to let it decide it either." But a single man, however good his intentions, cannot undo years of prejudice with words. And while Samuel wrestled with what he felt and what he feared losing if he said it aloud, his reputation, his cordial relationship with the most prosperous family in the valley, the social standing he had painstakingly built, time continued to run against Abigail, bringing her closer each day to the real possibility of having to abandon the only home she had ever known. The pressure reached a critical point one cold morning when Abigail received a visit from the town sheriff, an older man of few words who explained to her, with an awkwardness that made it clear he didn't enjoy his task, that some neighbors had filed a formal complaint about the use of the land where her house and workshop were located. The land had belonged to her father, but the original documents had been lost years ago in a fire that destroyed part of the town's archives, and without those papers, her right to ownership could be legally challenged by anyone willing to take the case to the county authorities. Abigail understood immediately who was behind this. She didn't need proof. The coincidence of timing spoke for itself. She stood on the threshold of her own home, listening to the sheriff explain that she had weeks to resolve the matter or risk losing everything, and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the ground beneath her feet could truly disappear. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the kitchen window, looking into the darkness where she knew, miles away, the lights of Samuel's house were probably still on, and allowed herself, for the first time, to admit to herself what she had been denying for years: that she loved him, that she had loved him for a long time, and that the thought of losing everything, her house, her workshop, perhaps even the possibility of continuing to live in this valley, hurt less than the thought of losing him without ever having told him the truth. But fear was still stronger than hope. What right did she have to ask a man like Samuel to carry all that would come if he dared to stand by her side openly? The town's contempt, the loss of business, the social shame that her family would never stop reminding her of. She told herself that true love sometimes meant asking for nothing. It meant letting go before dragging someone else into the same abyss she already lived in. Samuel, for his part, spent that same night tossing and turning in his own bed, unable to sleep, thinking of Abigail's expression when she told him about the land, that mixture of contained fury and resignation that he knew too well not to recognize as a silent surrender. He thought of the 6 years of shared afternoons, of the coffee served without him asking, of the warm cloth on his shoulder, of all the words he had never spoken because there was always an excuse to wait a little longer. He got up before dawn, saddled his horse, and rode directly to the sheriff's office, where he waited, sitting on the porch, until the man opened the door, still with his morning coffee in hand. Samuel wasted no time on pleasantries. He asked exactly what was needed to resolve the land issue, and when the sheriff explained that witnesses willing to formally declare the continuous possession of the Crow family for generations were required, Samuel replied without hesitation that he himself would testify, and that he knew at least 4 other families in the valley who would do the same if asked with the necessary seriousness. What Samuel didn't tell anyone that morning, not even himself entirely, was that this decision to publicly, formally, undeniably take Abigail's side meant forever renouncing the possibility of remaining neutral in the town's eyes. It meant choosing a side. And he chose, without hesitation, without needing more time to think about it. He spent the rest of the day riding through the valley on horseback, knocking on doors, talking to neighbors who, for years, had silently bought Abigail's fabric and sewing, but had never spoken a word in her public defense. Some refused, uncomfortable with the idea of confronting the Briggs family. But others, surprisingly, agreed, remembering old favors, remembering that Abigail's father had been a good man, remembering perhaps a twinge of their own shame for years of complicit silence. By the time the sun began to set, Samuel had 6 signed testimonies and the promise of a 7th. He rode back towards Abigail's workshop with the sunset painting the sky orange behind him, and found her sitting on her porch steps with a half-packed suitcase beside the door, because she had begun that same afternoon to seriously consider the idea of leaving before the decision was taken out of her hands. "What is this?" Samuel asked, dismounting quickly, pointing to the suitcase with a mixture of panic and something deeper he didn't bother to hide. "An option," Abigail replied, without looking him in the eye. "Just in case." But then, it was Samuel who decided he could wait no longer, that the words he had kept for 6 years couldn't wait another day or another hour, because the next time she considered leaving, he might not be there to stop her. "Abigail," he said, and his voice trembled in a way he himself hadn't expected. "Before you decide anything, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to me until the end, even if afterwards you tell me no." She finally looked up, and something in her expression, that mixture of hope she had learned to distrust in herself and fear of making another mistake, made Samuel feel the full weight of what he was about to do. Before continuing, it's worth pausing. From what country are you watching us today? Tell us in the comments, because this story, though it happened in a small valley over a century ago, still speaks to people from all corners of the world. "I've spent 6 years bringing shirts that didn't need mending," Samuel continued, his hands trembling slightly, holding his horse's reins as if needing something to cling to. 6 years inventing excuses to sit in your workshop and watch you work. and I never said anything because I was afraid of what the town would say. Afraid of complicating your life even more than it already is. Afraid that you wouldn't feel the same, and I would have ruined the only good thing I had in this valley. Abigail rose slowly, still saying nothing, listening to every word as one listens to something they have waited so long for that they almost dare not believe it is real. But today I went to talk to the sheriff, Samuel continued. And I went to talk to 6 families in town, and I told Eleanor Briggs in front of her father that I would never marry her because I have been in love with someone else for years, with you. And I don't care what the town thinks about it. I don't care about losing business or the good relationship with the Briggs or anything it might cost me. The only thing I care about is that you know the truth before you get on that suitcase and disappear from my life. The silence that followed lasted barely a few seconds, but to both of them, it seemed an eternity. Abigail felt something break inside her, not from pain, but from the sudden release of a weight she had carried for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like not to carry it. For years I've thought I deserved this, less than anyone else in this valley, she finally said, her voice breaking. That love was something that happened to others, to those who truly belonged somewhere. I was afraid to love you because loving you meant admitting how much I could lose. You won't lose me, Samuel said, approaching slowly, giving her space to move away if she needed to, though she didn't. I promise, no matter what the town decides to do to us. That's easy to say today, she replied, with an honesty he appreciated more than any sweet words. But the years are long, Samuel, and people get tired of fighting battles that aren't theirs. This one is mine, he said, and for the first time in 6 years, he raised his hand and lightly touched Abigail's cheek with his fingers. Slowly, like someone touching something they have feared breaking for too long. It's my battle because you are mine, if you'll let me be. And because I am yours, if you still want me. She didn't answer with words. She rested her hand on his, against her own cheek, and closed her eyes for a moment that seemed to contain 6 whole years of waiting. When she opened them again, the tears she had held back for weeks finally fell. But this time they were not tears of shame or fear. They were, simply, tears of someone finally allowing herself to feel what she had been denying for years. I do love you, she finally said. I've loved you for so long that I don't even remember what it was like not to. What followed was not a fairy tale kiss filled with music and perfect light. It was clumsy and real. Samuel's hands still trembling, Abigail's nervous laughter mingling with her own tears, Samuel's horse snorting impatiently behind them as if it also wanted to participate in the moment. But it was, for both of them, the beginning of something that no word from the town could now undo. In the following days, the land issue was formally resolved thanks to the gathered testimonies, with the sheriff officially recognizing Abigail's right to the property that had belonged to her family for 2 generations. The Briggs family, humiliated but without sufficient evidence to sustain a broader legal dispute, ultimately chose to withdraw from the matter, though Eleanor's cold stares on the street would continue for months. But what changed most was not the paperwork or the sheriff's ruling. It was the way Samuel began to appear beside Abigail in every public space in town, without hiding anything, without apologizing for his choice. He took her arm to the next community meeting, sitting beside her without caring who watched them. When any malicious comment reached his ears, he didn't respond with anger, but with a firm calm that made it clear his decision was not up for discussion. Little by little, some neighbors who had remained complicitly silent for years began to treat Abigail with a different respect, not because she had changed who she was, but because seeing someone openly defend her reminded them that their own silence had also been a choice. The sewing orders began to return, first slowly, then with a normalcy that had never quite existed before. They married in the spring in a small ceremony in front of Abigail's house, with the repaired shed visible behind them as a silent testament to all that had been built between small gestures long before there were words to name it. It wasn't a grand or elegant wedding. It was, however, entirely theirs. They built a life made of the same small things that had united them from the beginning. Samuel continued to bring clothes to the shop, though he no longer needed excuses to visit her. And Abigail continued to serve coffee in the same old cup, now with the certainty that he would return every afternoon, not because he had to, but because he chose to. They expanded the workshop over time, and Samuel built with his own hands a larger work table where Abigail taught the trade to 2 apprentices from the town, a decision that, years ago, no one would have imagined possible. Psychologist John Gottman, after decades studying lasting relationships, discovered that it's not grand declarations that sustain a marriage over time, but what he called the small bids for connection, repeated day after day, a coffee served, a roof repaired, a hand lingering a second longer than necessary. And that couples who thrive are precisely those who learn not to let those bids go unanswered. 22 years later, the Millhaven Creek Valley had changed in ways neither of them could have predicted. The mill still stood, though larger now. The road to the east had become somewhat more traveled, and Abigail's dress shop, now with a hand-painted sign above the door, was known throughout the county for the quality of its work, with no one caring, not remotely, where her blood came from. One autumn afternoon, with the golden light slanting through the same window as always, Samuel, his hair now graying at the temples, his hands calloused from years of working the land, entered the workshop with a shirt that, this time, did have a genuine tear in the sleeve. Abigail, with soft lines around her eyes that only appear after years of laughing with the same person, looked up from her work table and smiled in that particular way that, even after 2 decades, still made Samuel's heart quicken a little. "Another excuse?" she asked, taking the shirt in her hands. "This time it's real," he replied, sitting down in the chair that had been reserved for him for 22 years, though they had never said it aloud. "But if it weren't, I wouldn't mind either." She laughed, that laugh he had learned to seek in every corner of every day, and as she threaded her needle, her fingers brushed for a moment against his, which held the shirt spread out for her. It was a minimal gesture, repeated thousands of times over the years, and yet it still carried the same silent weight it had carried that first afternoon, so long ago, when 2 people the whole world insisted on keeping separate decided, instead, to stay. Because that, in the end, is what this story teaches. That true love rarely arrives announced with fireworks. It arrives slowly, in coffees served without being asked, in roofs repaired in silence, in someone deciding on any given day that they can no longer stay silent for another minute. And sometimes, all it takes to change the destiny of someone the world has decided not to want is a single person willing to stay, despite everything, by their side.